My friends, the Detroit Lions have just received a piece of off-season recognition that is creating plenty of discussion, especially because it comes during the quietest stretch of the NFL calendar. With minicamps finished, OTAs behind us, and training camp still weeks away, this is normally the time when conversations shift away from breaking news and toward evaluating everything that happened over the past several months. Instead of focusing on rumors or unrealistic trade ideas, it's the perfect opportunity to take a closer look at what this roster has become and whether Detroit truly positioned itself to take another step forward. One of the biggest talking points comes from ESPN analyst Seth Walder, who recently handed out offseason grades for every NFL team. While several franchises earned A and A- grades, the Lions received a solid B. At first glance, some fans might see that as slightly disappointing considering how high expectations are surrounding this team, but once you dig deeper into the reasoning, the conversation becomes much more interesting. According to the evaluation, one of Detroit's best offseason moves was drafting offensive tackle Blake Miller as the eventual replacement for Taylor Decker. Considering the financial commitment that would have been required to keep Decker long-term, this move represents a forward-thinking decision. Rather than waiting until the offensive line became a problem, the Lions invested in a young player who can grow into the position while keeping the roster financially flexible for the future. Another move that received praise was trading David Montgomery to the Houston Texans. That decision may still be difficult for many fans because Montgomery became one of the emotional leaders of Detroit's offense. He ran with toughness, embraced the physical identity Dan Campbell wants, and delivered some of the best football of his career wearing a Lions uniform. But looking strictly from a roster-building perspective, the move makes sense. Detroit already has Jahmyr Gibbs as its featured running back, and maximizing resources while opening opportunities for younger players fits the organization's long-term philosophy. The one criticism that stood out involved the extension given to linebacker Jack Campbell. The grading suggested that extending Campbell was not a positive move, but that opinion is likely to generate disagreement among many Lions supporters. Campbell has continued to establish himself as one of the foundational pieces of this defense, and Detroit clearly believes his leadership, consistency, and development justify making him part of the franchise's future. But instead of focusing only on one analyst's grade, the far more interesting discussion is comparing this year's roster to what the Lions looked like exactly 1 year ago. When you line up the two versions side by side, the amount of change is remarkable, and it highlights just how much an NFL roster evolves between early July and the beginning of the regular season. Start with the offense. At quarterback, nothing changes. Jared Goff remains firmly in control of one of the league's most efficient offenses. Sam LaPorta continues to headline the tight end room, while Jahmyr Gibbs remains the centerpiece of the running game. Those positions already featured elite talent, so continuity alone becomes a major strength entering another season. The wide receiver room, however, tells a much different story. 1 year ago, Tim Patrick was expected to occupy the number 3 receiver role behind Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams. Fast forward to today, and Isaac Tesla has stepped into that conversation instead. When comparing the two situations, there is every reason to believe Detroit enters this season in a stronger position. Patrick ultimately was released, proving once again how unpredictable NFL rosters can be throughout training camp and preseason. Looking deeper into last year's receiver depth chart reminds everyone how many names disappeared before meaningful football even began. Players like Malik Taylor, Ronnie Bell, and others were once competing for roster spots, yet very few remained part of the long-term picture. Jackson Meeks is still around, but the overall depth has clearly evolved through another offseason of competition and evaluation. Perhaps the most significant improvement appears along the offensive line. Last year's projected group looked very different from what Detroit is preparing to field now. Christian Mahogany has another year of experience. Tate Ratledge enters his second season instead of arriving as a rookie. Cade Mays is expected to provide stronger play than what Graham Glasgow delivered during last season. Blake Miller steps into an important role replacing Taylor Decker, while the overall depth behind the starters has become much stronger. The backup offensive linemen deserve attention as well, because this is an area that often decides whether a team survives the long NFL season. Larry Borum strengthens the tackle depth. Juice Scruggs provides another capable interior option. Ben Bart adds more competition. Giovanni Manu continues his development with additional experience under his belt. Compared to 1 year ago, the Lions appear to have significantly improved not only their starting five, but also the players waiting behind them. Even when looking for weaknesses, there are not many obvious concerns on offense. The only position where Detroit may have taken a step backward on paper is the backup running back role after Montgomery's departure. Replacing a player who consistently produced tough yards is never easy. However, the Lions have repeatedly demonstrated that their offensive line creates opportunities for running backs to succeed, and history suggests this coaching staff has been extremely effective at maximizing production from the position. As training camp approaches, these roster comparisons become even more fascinating because they remind everyone that what fans see today will almost certainly continue changing before week 1 finally arrives. New competitions will emerge, unexpected players will rise, and some familiar names may ultimately not survive final roster cuts. But based strictly on where this roster stands today compared to this same point last year, there is a legitimate argument that Detroit's offense has quietly become even stronger. Do you agree that the Lions enter this season with a better offensive roster than they had at this same time last year? Or do you think there are still questions that could keep this offense from taking another step forward? Now let's shift the conversation to the defensive side of the football, because this is where opinions begin to split. While the offense appears to have taken a noticeable step forward, the defense is a little more difficult to evaluate. There are improvements in some areas, there are questions in others, and ultimately the answer may not come until these players finally get on the field together during training camp and the regular season. Looking at the defensive front, the Lions still have one of the cornerstones of the entire franchise leading the way with Aiden Hutchinson. Alongside him, the defensive line continues to feature familiar names that have already proven they can contribute. When comparing this year's group with what Detroit had exactly 1 year ago, the difference isn't necessarily about having bigger stars. Instead, it's about having better depth and more competition across the roster. Last year, the projected defensive front included Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, and Marcus Davenport. On paper, that group looked promising. The problem was always availability. Injuries prevented the Lions from consistently seeing the version of that defensive line they had hoped to build. This year, the roster appears to have learned from that experience by adding more players capable of rotating through the defensive front. DJ Wonnum brings experience and reliability, giving Detroit another edge defender capable of contributing throughout the season. The roster also includes young players who now have opportunities to prove themselves instead of simply filling out the depth chart. Derek Moore enters the picture as another player expected to strengthen the defensive rotation, while additional depth pieces create far more competition than existed a year ago. One of the biggest themes throughout this roster comparison is that Detroit is no longer relying on a handful of starters to carry the team. Brad Holmes has continued building layers of depth, understanding that an NFL season is won by the players who are still available in December and January, not simply by the stars who appear on the opening day roster. The linebacker position is probably where the Lions may have taken their biggest step backward on paper. Last season, Alex Anzalone brought veteran leadership and stability to the middle of the defense. His experience was difficult to replace, and now Malcolm Rodriguez is expected to handle a much larger role after previously serving primarily as a backup. That doesn't automatically mean the linebacker room will struggle. Rodriguez has already shown he can play meaningful snaps when called upon, but replacing a veteran presence like Anzalone isn't something that happens overnight. It will require growth, consistency, and communication throughout the season. Fortunately for Detroit, Jack Campbell continues to develop into one of the leaders of this defense, making the transition much smoother than it otherwise might have been. The secondary also deserves a closer look because this may quietly become one of the deepest position groups on the roster. While many of the familiar names remain, Detroit has added several players who increase competition and provide valuable insurance throughout a long season. The additions of Izzy, Clark, and McCreary immediately strengthen the depth of the defensive backfield. Even if not every newcomer earns a starting role, having multiple capable defensive backs becomes incredibly valuable once injuries inevitably begin affecting NFL rosters. Comparing this group with last year's version reveals another important difference. 1 year ago, the Lions were relying on several players who ultimately didn't provide the consistency they were hoping for. This year's roster appears much deeper from top to bottom, giving the coaching staff significantly more flexibility depending on weekly matchups. One particularly interesting comparison involves Mike McCreary and Amon-Ra Robertson. While Robertson certainly had his moments, the overall body of work left room for improvement. The evaluation points toward McCreary providing a more reliable option based on overall performance, and that could become an underrated upgrade if it translates onto the field. The safety position still carries some uncertainty simply because health will determine everything. There are questions surrounding when key contributors will be fully available, making it difficult to declare that the starting secondary is definitively stronger today than it was 1 year ago. However, when discussing the entire defensive back room rather than only the starters, there is a strong argument that Detroit has more overall talent available than it did entering last season. Depth may not generate headlines during July, but it often determines who is still playing meaningful football in January. The Lions appear to understand that lesson better than ever before. When stepping back and looking at the roster as a whole, the picture becomes much clearer. The offense appears stronger than it was 1 year ago. The offensive line has improved both among the starters and the backups. The receiver room looks deeper. The core playmakers remain intact defensively, while there are still legitimate questions at linebacker and some uncertainty surrounding the health of key contributors in the secondary. The overall depth across the defensive roster has unquestionably improved. That's why a B offseason grade feels reasonable, even if many Detroit fans may believe this team deserves more credit. The reality is that the Lions were never expected to dominate free agency with massive spending. They simply didn't have unlimited salary cap flexibility. Instead, Brad Holmes continued following the philosophy that has transformed this franchise over the past